I mentioned in a previous section of this course that it doesn't require a whole lot of technical knowledge to be a good animator, but it requires an observed eye. Now, how do you get to that point? How do you get to the point where your eye is trained to understand motion and how it needs to look? Well, one way is to animate many, many things, to animate everything, and to animate a lot. But that's going to take a lot of time, and it might take a lot of guesswork. So is there a way we can kind of jumpstart our knowledge in this area? And the answer is yes. The way we can jumpstart our knowledge is by seeking the knowledge of animators who have come before us. And a great way to do that is through books. In particular, this book, which is The Illusion of Life. And this book was written by some of the original Disney animators, two of the 9 old men. It was written by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, and within here contains a journal of the various challenges Disney animators faced and overcame on the films they worked on. It is an excellent read, especially for those of you who might be going into this for yourself and plan on making your own productions, but it's a great read for any animator in particular because it contains something in it called the 12 Principles of Animation. The 12 Principles of Animation are often referred to as the animator's Bible, and we'll be discussing them in this course. So in this section, we're going to take our first look at the 12 Principles of Animation, and what's great is even though they are contained within this book, you can find them all over the internet in various forms and even video examples of them. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at the 12 Principles of Animation and start our discussion on the topic. The 12 Principles of Animation are the animator's Bible, and it is a list that was recorded by the 9 old men who are the legendary Disney animators who were responsible for pioneering this industry and creating some of the most well-known animated features in history. This list is a way to create better-looking animations that have more appeal and abide by real-world physics. So let's go ahead and get into the first principle of the 12 principles here, which is going to be squash and stretch. We already have some familiarity with this because we've used it in our own animation for our ball. And if we take a look at our ball rig, we can see that squash and stretch is being used here to add this idea of compression to the ball. Now, what is squash and stretch exactly? I like to think of squash and stretch as the transfer of energy. So what does that mean? Well, what are we simulating by making a ball squash? If we have the ball here, it squashes down, it stretches, and then it jumps. We're simulating the same motion a human would have to go through. If a human's just standing here, and a human wants to jump, the human's going to have to get down into a jump position. Then to get off the ground, they're going to have to stretch into a push-off position. And then finally, they're going to get into the air and prepare to land, which is going to require them to stretch out. And then once they hit the ground, they're going to squash in, and then they can finally stand up. So a bouncing ball and a jumping person have a lot in common. And what's happening here is essentially the transfer of energy. So if we think of something like physics, the squash stage here is where we store energy. The stretch phase here is where we release energy. From there, it goes into motion. So a lot of animation is thinking about energy because it's how we move. So squash and stretch is tracking the energy along the motion, and it adds a bit of appeal to our image. Let's go ahead and take a look at the second principle, which is something called anticipation. Anticipation is where the performer telegraphs the action, meaning that they kind of give a sign that they're about to do something. For example, with a jump, if we just have the ball go from here to here, that doesn't really feel like a jump. The squash not only acts as squash and stretch, it also acts as anticipation. So we're anticipating jumping when we squash down. Now, likewise, the stretch downward is anticipating landing. That's with the bouncing ball, but there's other various forms of anticipation you can think about. Some of them are psychological. For example, they'll show up on the face. Let's say a character is going to deliver really bad news to someone. Maybe their face looks regretful before they speak. That could be an acting point for anticipation. It can be other things too, like the wind up before a baseball pitch. The next one is going to be staging. Staging deals with the actual visuals on screen, the composition, and how it's assembled. So when we deal with staging in a scene, we want to think about the picture frame and how the character is going to appear on the picture frame. So is my ball just going to appear in there? Or are we going to add some appeal to it by maybe giving it ground, and maybe we add in a little bit of a background and maybe some cloudy skies? We're probably not going to go to those extremes, but staging is going to regard how things are set up. And we generally want to stage things so that the animation is clear, and we'll discuss that later on, but also that it utilizes cinematography principles, which we'll explore in a later section. After that, we have methods, and we haven't quite explored these, but there's two common methods to animating. There's one called straight ahead, and this is largely what we've been doing so far. Straight ahead is where you just go one keyframe to the next to make your animation. But on more complex productions for things like characters, you need to take an approach that uses pose to pose. So how would this go? Well, with straight ahead, if I was animating a ball squashing and stretching, I would do my neutral frame, my squash frame, my stretch frame, my jump frame, my stretch frame, my squash frame, and my neutral frame all at once. But in pose to pose, I would start with something called the extremes, which would be my start pose, up pose, and end pose. From there, I'd go ahead and do my breakdowns, which would then be my squash and my stretches, and my squash and my stretches. So in short, we look for the large movements first, and then we go back and refine in the pose-to-pose method. We'll explore the pose-to-pose method as we move forward in the course, and we start to develop more complex-looking characters and rigs. The next one's going to be follow-through and overlapping action. Follow-through and overlapping action is when you have multiple things moving at once. Now, we don't have a rig complex enough to look at this, but the idea is if we had, let's say, a ball with an antenna on it, and this ball were to move forward, this ball wouldn't just move with the antenna straight up. This antenna would have some pushback from the air, and it would have follow-through, meaning that it follows the motion. So as this moves forward, what we would see is that the antenna bends backwards and tilts backwards. So that's the idea of having follow through. If this were to stop as well, this ball wouldn't just stop stiff like this. What would happen is this would flop forward, and then it would flop backwards a little bit, and then it would flop forward again, and then maybe after that, it would finally stop. So that's going to be the idea there with follow through and overlapping action, as far as follow through is concerned. Now, when it comes to overlapping action is where you have more than one motion happening at a time. So for example, if a character is talking, maybe their lips are moving, but maybe they're also moving their hand. And that would be an example that you would commonly see. The next principle is going to be slow in and slow out. We already looked at that with the graph editor briefly, and the graph editor, slow in and slow out, was described by the curves having a slow curve at the beginning and a slow curve at the end, where between point A and B here, it's going slow, and same up here, because we have a lot of keyframes in that section over a longer period of time than this midsection here, where it's going fast. Now, the way this was achieved in the past, when it came to traditional drawings, is they would draw a lot of poses close together. For example, if we were doing the drawings for a bouncing ball, your first frame might be the ball and this pose. Next, you might be squashing, then you might be squashing a little bit more, then you might be squashing all the way. And then from there, we might do our initial stretch, and then we might stretch a little bit more, and then we might stretch a lot of it. And then from here to the jump pose, the ball might be here and then here. So this would be our slow here, but the jump itself is going to be fast to convey that speed. And then coming down, we'd have the same deal where we're going to hit, and we're probably going to hit pretty quick. So we're probably going to get there pretty quick. But coming out of here, we might take our time to show a longer recovery. This is mostly done in an automated way for us in 3D, but we still have to be mindful when we're doing complex animations of things like characters to give the motion enough time and enough keyframes to read correctly as a slow in and slow out. Be aware this is automated to an extent with things like the bouncing ball, but when we get to more complex things like characters, we're going to have to be more mindful of our motions. The next one's going to be arcs, or arc. The idea behind arcs is that things generally move in arcs. Now, what's nice is, once again, with 3D, a lot of this is going to be animated for us because we create rigs that do this for us. But the idea is, if we had something like a character's arm, and they were to have their arm down here, and they were to lift it, their arm wouldn't lift in a straight line like this from point A to point B. So those wouldn't be our drawing series. It would animate in an arc. So if it were lifting, what we would have is an arc shape like this, and that's because this is rotating around a pivot, and if you rotate out a pivot, you're going to naturally get an arc. This still matters for our own motion. For example, let's say we had a bouncing ball bouncing across the screen. Well, we could look at the trail of this bouncing ball, and the incorrect trail would be something like this. This would not be what we would expect. This is very robotic. What we'd expect this to look like is arcs, like this, and that would be the pathway it bounces around. So arcs don't only apply to things like the rotational pivot of an arm, it really applies to just about any motion. Most things move in an arced way. Next, we're going to have secondary action. Secondary action is where you have some other form of action going on in addition to the primary action. So when you think about an animated cartoon and the distance past, you would often have a character just wander onto screen and everything is stiff as can be. The whole background is just a static image. And it looked entertaining enough, but it didn't really look realistic. And that's because things like trees sway in the breeze, bushes jiggle a little bit, water ripples. These are all the things that deal with secondary actions. In other words, there's going to be other motion in the scene besides the first motion. Now, this can also be secondary action on a character. It could be something they are doing, or maybe an accessory they're wearing. So, for example, if a character is talking and it's a close-up of their head, maybe they're wearing earrings, and their earrings are also swaying back and forth as they move their head. So those are all examples of things that could be secondary action, but we want to look for that where that's possible. Now, that's not always possible, though. So just be aware that the 12 principles of animation are not applicable all times, okay? But they're general rules we should anticipate following. Next, we have a very important one, which is timing. Timing is going to refer to having proper time to an animation. Now, how do you find the proper time to an animation? Well, that is a good question. A lot of it comes from observed experience. So just from animating things, you can judge how fast is going to be too fast, how fast is going to be too slow. So for example, with the bouncing ball, I used an example of 24 frames or 1 second, and this looks acceptable for the motion. This comes from demonstrating this for many years. 1 second works fine for this, but I could make it longer. I could potentially try 2 seconds and make it jump higher. I could also go even shorter to 12 seconds and it would probably still look fine. So there's a wide range of acceptable times. But how do we find the timing for something complex like a character or an animal? Well, a great way to find the correct timing is actually through reference. Nowadays, we have the ability to record ourselves anytime we like. We have endless amounts of digital media we can access, from movies to various clips from websites like YouTube. So there's really an endless amount of reference, not to mention we also have stock video sites. Back in the day, before we had all this digital media, Disney would actually bring in footage for animators to look at. Not just that, he would have drawing sessions where they would bring in things like animals, for example, for Bambi, to the actual campus that Disney was at, and they would have the artists spend the day drawing animals, learning how they move, and observing them. So working from the real world is really where you're going to start to understand timing largely, and working from reference. Next is exaggeration. Exaggeration, as it sounds, is pushing things past reality, making them as exaggerated as they can be to add appeal. Or perhaps not as exaggerated as they can be, but exaggerated enough to add a good level of appeal. An example here is our bouncing ball. Do balls really squash and stretch this much in the real world? No, but also balls don't bounce on their own in the real world. So there's also that. We're not exactly showing a ball bouncing, we're showing a ball jumping, and therefore we've transferred the exaggerated motion of a jump onto the ball here. And that's the idea behind exaggeration. It's pushing the bounds of reality, but still maintaining an acceptable level of visual appeal that the audience will accept. So exaggeration is about pushing what we see in reality and adding a bit more appeal to the motion. Next is solid drawing. Now, this one is a bit obscured in our day and age, but it still has good context in terms of what we're trying to achieve. When we talk about solid drawing in the traditional sense that Disney animators meant, they meant to draw really good. And not just that, but to draw in 3 dimensions so that if a character's on screen, it actually looks like the character's looking up or looking away, what have you. This is still the case if you're doing 2-dimensional drawing, you're going to need those skills. But when it comes to 3D drawing, it means 2 things. First off, it's going to mean good models. But the other thing it's going to mean is strong poses. So strong keyframes, meaning that your poses look really good. Because the idea of posing a character is the same idea as drawing them. We want to think of our camera as our canvas that we're drawing the animation onto and that we're performing to. Thinking of 3D as 2D is one of the best ways to create really nice looking animations. The final principle is going to be appeal. Appeal is one of the more abstract ones, but the idea is to create something that is appealing. This means it is nice to look at visually, and it's also nice to look at in terms of motion. Motion can be very jarring at times, and you may have an animation that is timed correctly and has arcs and has pretty much all the principles of animation applied to them, but it may lack appeal, and appeal ultimately is going to be why you want to look at it. So one of the reasons why a lot of animations are more cartoony or more exaggerated is because reality largely lacks the appeal that we can capture in animation. Harnessing our artistic ability is really what appeal comes into. So this is the 12 principles of animation, and we're going to continue to explore these as we go throughout the course. If you would like visual examples out there, there are amazing videos out there on websites like YouTube you can check out that go over these in a visual way and can explain them a bit more clearly than I can just in a written format here. But hopefully that gives you a good introduction to these, and as I use these terms, you'll understand them moving forward. So I wanted to lay this foundation here so that we have all these terms within our lingo and we can utilize these moving forward. Something to be aware of with the 12 principles of animation, though, is that these are not always present in every animation. And I kind of mentioned that previously when we talked a bit about things like follow through and overlapping action. You're not always going to have follow through and overlapping action in every animation. You're not going to have secondary action in every animation. You may not even have arcs in every animation. It just varies. But this is a general list of things to look for and to check off when you're doing your animation to make sure you're applying them to add appeal and realism to your animation. So just be aware that you won't check all 12 boxes on every last single thing you do, but you should keep in mind each of these to make sure you are applying them where necessary. So with that said, let's go ahead and continue our exploration of animation and create an animation of our ball bouncing forward to create a more complex scenario for us to test our read in.